She should not have been in that wing of the house. Everyone knew the east corridor of Harwick Manor was sealed after dark. The servants never walked it. The housemaids whispered about it with their eyes low. Even the butler, old Mr. Fenwick, who had worked the estate for 30 years, would not carry a candle past the third door on the left. No one asked why. No one needed to. Some silences in grand houses were not mysteries. They were warnings. But Cordelia Vane had never been good at heeding warnings. She had come down from her room at midnight only because she could not sleep. The summer heat had crept into the upper floors and pressed itself against her like something unwanted. She had lain on her bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling while the whole house breathed slowly around her. And then she had risen. She slipped on her thin cotton robe and walked out into the hall with no particular destination in mind. She had meant to go to the library. She had walked that route 12 times since arriving at Harwick Manor 3 weeks ago as her sister's companion. But she took a wrong turn near the portrait gallery, and the candle in her hand threw flickering light across a corridor she did not recognize, and before she understood what she had done, she was standing in the east wing. She should have turned around. Instead, she heard a voice. It was low and careful and male, coming from behind the third door on the left, saying her sister's name the way a man says a name he has held in his mouth for a very long time. She did not knock. She did not wait. Not. She pushed that door open with her bare hand and walked straight into a secret that was never meant for her. The Duke spun around. The papers on the desk scattered. The woman beside him snapped the leather folio shut, and the whole room went so still that the only sound left was the fire burning low in the grate. He looked at her across that room with an expression that was not anger, not embarrassment, but something far more dangerous than either. Because he knew exactly what she had heard before she opened that door. And now, there was no closing it again. The secret the Duke of Harwick had been keeping about her sister in that sealed room at midnight was only the beginning of everything Cordelia Vane was never supposed to know. But here is the question that changes everything. What exactly was the Duke hiding about her sister, and how far was he willing to go to make sure it never came to light? Subscribe now and drop a comment on where you're watching from. Cordelia Vane had not wanted to come to Harwick Manor. That was the first truth, and it sat quietly in her chest, the way truths sometimes do when they are too honest to be spoken aloud. She was 23 years old, the second daughter of Sir Edmund Vane, a baronet with more land than money and more pride than sense. She had a good face and gentle manners, and a mind that her mother considered too active for her own good. She read widely. She formed opinions. She expressed them on occasion. These were not qualities that the marriage market rewarded, and so at 23 Cordelia remained unmarried while her elder sister Harriet, at 26, had somehow managed to catch the attention of one of the most powerful and desired men in England, the Duke of Harwick. His name was Gideon Ashmore, and the mere mention of it in a drawing room was enough to straighten spines and sharpen glances. He was 31, inherited the dukedom at 19 after his father's sudden death, and had spent the 12 years since managing one of the largest estates in the country, with a reputation for being both formidably intelligent and deeply private. He was not unkind, those who knew him said. He simply did not waste warmth. He gave what was necessary and nothing more, and he did it with such composure that people often left his company feeling both satisfied and strangely cold. He had been introduced to Harriet at the Whitmore Ball in April. By June, he had called on Sir Edmund twice. By July, an understanding was quietly forming, not yet an engagement, but close enough that the whole county could smell it. And then Harriet had written to Cordelia. The letter had been cheerful on the surface. Harriet's letters always were. She wrote the way she smiled brightly and with precision, giving just enough warmth to be convincing and not enough to be fully believed. She said she was enjoying her time at Harwick Manor as the Duke's invited guest. She said the gardens were extraordinary. She said she would love to have Cordelia's company, as the days were long and she missed her sister terribly. Their mother had folded the letter and handed it to Cordelia with the look she reserved for instructions she did not intend to debate. So Cordelia had packed a trunk and came. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, stepping out of the carriage onto the gravel drive and tilting her head back to look at the house. Harwick Manor was vast in a way that did not feel welcoming. It had columns and wings and rows of tall windows that reflected the sky back at you rather than letting you see in. The grounds were immaculate. The staff stood at their stations with perfect posture. Everything about the place declared its own importance without apology. Cordelia had looked at it and felt, quite unexpectedly, a pull of sadness she could not explain. Harriet had met her at the door, looking lovely as she always did. She was taller than Cordelia and finer boned, with their mother's golden hair and the particular kind of beauty that made rooms go quiet when she entered them. She embraced Cordelia warmly, kissed her cheek, and linked their arms to lead her inside, speaking quickly and lightly about the other guests and the schedule for the week, and how glad she was that Cordelia had come. She had not looked Cordelia in the eyes during any of it. That was the second truth, and Cordelia filed it away without comment. The house party at Harwick Manor that summer was not large. There were perhaps 14 guests in total, gathered under the pretense of a seasonal visit, but everyone understood the real occasion. The Duke was considering Harriet seriously. Society had come to observe. The guest list included Lord Prentice and his wife, who were old friends of the Ashmore family. There was Sir Thomas Graves, a member of Parliament with a loud laugh and careful eyes. Lady Mirabelle Dunn, a widow of 40 with sharp wit and sharper jewellery, had come down from Edinburgh. There were two younger women, Miss Clara Fitch and Miss Poppy Alderton, who were cousins and came as a pair, always whispering together and watching everything with the hungry attention of girls who understood that proximity to power was a form of currency. And there was the Duke's younger brother, Mr. Sebastian Ashmore, who was 27 and entirely different from Gideon in every visible way. Where Gideon was controlled, Sebastian was restless. Where Gideon spoke carefully, Sebastian spoke too much and laughed at the wrong moments and seemed perpetually on the edge of some minor disaster. He was charming in the way that people who have given up on being taken seriously are often charming, freely and without strategy. He had kind eyes and untidy hair and a habit of appearing at Cordelia's elbow at odd moments and saying things that were either very clever or very foolish, and she could never quite decide which. She had liked him immediately, which made her trust the feeling less. Their first real conversation had happened on the second morning of her visit. She had risen early and gone to the garden before the other guests were stirring, carrying a book she had no intention of reading and wearing her simplest morning dress. The garden at that hour was something different from what it became later in the day when it was properly observed. In the early morning it was just a garden, cool and green and indifferent to its own beauty. Sebastian had been sitting on a stone bench near the rose hedge, doing nothing. Not reading, not writing, not performing any of the small occupations that guests perform to justify their presence outdoors. simply sitting with his elbows on his knees and looking at the middle distance. He had looked up when he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, and something in his face had shifted. Not surprising exactly. Something more like recognition, though they had barely spoken the night before. "Good morning," he had said. "You are the first sensible person I have seen today." She had looked around at the empty garden. "There is no one else here," she had pointed out. "Exactly," he had said, and smiled. She had sat on the bench across from him, and they had talked for almost an hour. He was funny in a dry, reluctant way, as if humour was something that escaped him against his better judgment. He spoke about the estate with a complicated fondness, or was the way people speak about homes they love and do not particularly want to be in. He asked her about herself with real curiosity, not the polished, performative curiosity of drawing-room conversation, but the slightly inconvenient kind that required honest answers. She had given him honest answers, which surprised her. He had told her, near the end of their conversation, that Harwick Manor had not felt this crowded since before his father died. She had said she was sorry. He had shrugged and said that grief was a strange thing, that it arrived late sometimes and stayed in rooms you forgot to close. Then he glanced toward the house with an expression she could not read, and said nothing more about it. She had thought about that look later. She thought about it several times over the following days as the house party proceeded through its careful routines. The morning rides and afternoon teas and evening dinners, where the Duke sat at the head of the table and presided over everything with that composed, measuring gaze of his. Gideon Ashmore in person was not quite what she had expected, and she had not expected anything flattering. She had come prepared to find him cold and proud and dull in the particular way of men who had never needed to be interesting. What she found instead was more complicated and considerably more troubling. He was not dull. He was watchful. There was a difference. He listened to conversations he did not join. He observed things quietly, the small social movements of a room, who spoke to whom, who laughed at what, who said one thing and meant another, and he did it without appearing to. It was only if you were watching him as carefully as he was watching everyone else that you caught it, the slight shift of his attention, the brief stillness of his expression when something registered. Cordelia had caught it on the third evening, and then she had found herself doing it again and again, watching him watch the room, and it was during one of these moments that she had noticed something that sat uneasily in her chest. He watched Harriet very little. For a man who was allegedly forming an attachment, he directed almost no sustained attention toward her. He was perfectly courteous when they spoke. He offered his arm when it was expected. He performed every required gesture of a gentleman who was paying a lady particular attention. But the warmth was not there. Or if it was buried so deeply that it read as its absence. What made this worse was that Harriet did not seem to notice, or perhaps she had decided not to. And what made it worse still was that Cordelia caught him watching her instead. Not the way men watched women when they meant it. Not the open, deliberate attention that was its own kind of declaration. It was subtler than that. She would look up from her book during the afternoon and find his gaze moving away from her face. She would be speaking to Sebastian or to Lady Mirabelle and feel a weight at her back, and when she turned there he was, attending to something else entirely, only just a breath too late. She told herself she was imagining it. She was quite good at telling herself things. On the 8th day of her visit, something happened that she could not explain away. The afternoon had turned rainy. Most of the guests had gathered in the main drawing room to read or talk or play cards. Cordelia had excused herself early, claiming a headache that was half true, and had gone to the library, which was where she had discovered she liked to be when the house felt too present around her. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the door open. She had assumed it was a servant. She had not looked up from her page. Then the sound stopped and did not continue, and after a moment she looked up. The Duke was standing just inside the door. He had not come to retrieve a book. There was no book in his hand, and he had not moved toward the shelves. He was standing with one hand still on the doorframe looking at her, and when their eyes met, he did not look away with the polite speed that the situation required. He simply looked at her, and she looked back. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which in the middle of an afternoon in a quiet library is long enough to matter. Then he said, "Miss Vane," and it came out slightly wrong, slightly lower than it should have been, and he cleared his throat and said he had not known the room was occupied. She said she hoped she was not in the way. He said she was not. He crossed to the far shelf, removed a book he did not open, and left. Cordelia sat with her page unread for the next 10 minutes and told herself something very firmly several times. That evening at dinner, Harriet was brilliant. She wore a cream satin gown with gold embroidery at the cuffs, and she was funny and clever and exactly what the table needed. Drawing out Sir Thomas and charming Lord Prentice and making Lady Mirabelle laugh with something she said about London in August. She was magnificent, genuinely, and Cordelia watched her with the complicated love of someone who has spent a lifetime being second, and knows it is not Harriet's fault. After dinner, while the women gathered in the sitting room and waited for the men to finish their port, Miss Clara Fitch settled beside Cordelia on the settee with the air of someone who had been saving something up. "She is extraordinary, your sister," Clara said, with a smile that was 90% genuine and 10% something else. The Duke must see it clearly. Cordelia agreed. Although Clara continued, lowering her voice with the practiced naturalness of a born gossip, "I did hear something rather curious from Mrs. Fenwick when she brought my morning tray today." Cordelia said nothing, which Clara took as permission to continue. "She said the East Wing has been opened twice this week after midnight," Clara said. She was quite sure of it because she heard the floorboards. And apparently she saw a light under the door of the old study. She said she did not go closer because the Duke had given strict instructions years ago that that wing was to remain private. Clara paused to let this settle. Cordelia said it was probably a servant attending to something. Clara smiled. "Of course," she said. "Of course it is." The men came through shortly after, and the conversation widened and moved on, and Cordelia put the thing out of her mind. But that night, lying in the heat with the ceiling above her and the house breathing slowly all around her, she found that she could not sleep. And when she rose and took her candle and walked out into the hall with the intention of finding her way to the library, she was already thinking about what Clara had said. She took a wrong turn near the portrait gallery. She recognized the East Corridor only when she was already in it. She should have turned around. She heard a voice behind the third door on the left. It was low and careful and male. It was saying her sister's name the way a name becomes something else when it has been kept too long in secret. Cordelia's hand touched the door, and she pushed it open. The room inside was lit by a single lamp on the writing desk in the corner. The walls were lined with papers and old maps and things that looked like documents, stacked and rolled and gathered with the dense attention of a man who had been building something in private for a very long time. There was a fire in the hearth despite the summer heat, and the ashes in the grate suggested it had been burning for hours. Gideon Ashmore was standing with his back to the door. He was not alone. Mrs. Dorothea Peel stood beside the writing desk. She was the Duke's private secretary, a serious woman of about 50 with silver-streaked hair and a face built for keeping things. She had always moved quietly through the house, present at the edges of things, noted and then forgotten. Now she stood with a leather folio open in her hands and her eyes on the Duke. And she was speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment the door opened. Both of them turned. Gideon looked at Cordelia. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then his expression changed, not to anger, not to embarrassment, to something more dangerous than either, to a controlled and private recognition. He knew exactly what she had heard before she opened the door. "Miss Vane?" he said very quietly. And Cordelia understood, standing in the doorway of a room she had not been meant to find, holding her candle in a hand that had gone slightly cold, that the next thing he said would either explain everything or explain nothing at all. She waited, and the Duke of Harwick closed the door behind her. The door made no sound when it closed. That was the thing Cordelia noticed first, the absence of noise, as if even the house understood that what happened in this room was not meant to travel. The latch caught softly, and the world outside, the sleeping corridor, the sealed wing, the rest of Harwick Manor with its 14 guests and 30 servants and carefully managed surfaces, became something on the other side of a wall. Gideon did not move away from the door immediately. He stood with his hand still resting lightly on the frame, and he looked at her in the way she had caught him looking at her before, except that now there was nowhere for either of them to pretend it was something else. Mrs. Dorothea Peel had closed the leather folio. She stood beside the desk with the composed stillness of a woman who had witnessed many difficult moments and understood that her role in this one was to be invisible until told otherwise. Cordelia found her voice before she found her composure. "I took a wrong turn," she said. "I heard a voice." He said nothing. "I was not listening at the door," she continued, "because it felt important to establish this, even if no one had accused her of it. I only heard my sister's name. And I stopped. Still nothing." The lamp on the desk threw a steady gold light across the room and across his face, and he watched her with that careful, measuring attention of his. And she had the strange sensation of being read like a document he had not expected to receive. Then he said, "How much of it did you hear?" "One sentence," she said. "Only her name." Then he studied her face as if looking for the lie, and either found no lie or found something else that made him make a decision, because his shoulders shifted slightly, and he turned and walked to the fireplace and stood with one hand on the mantel, looking into the low burning fire. "Dorothea," he said quietly, "you may leave us." Mrs. Peel crossed the room without a word, without a glance at Cordelia, and slipped out through a side door that Cordelia had not noticed before. It closed behind her with the same silence as everything else in this wing. They were alone. This was not appropriate. Cordelia was fully aware of this. She was standing alone with a duke in a sealed room after midnight, in a house where her sister was a guest with matrimonial expectations. There was no version of this that society would describe charitably. She should leave. She should excuse herself and walk back to her room and tell no one and spend the remainder of her visit being carefully unremarkable. She did not leave. "You should sit down," he said, still looking at the fire. "I am perfectly capable of standing," she said. A brief pause. Then something crossed his face that was almost a smile. "I know you are," he said. "I am asking anyway." She sat in the chair nearest the door, which she chose deliberately, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him, and waited. He turned from the fire. He did not sit. He was still in his evening clothes from dinner, his cravat loosened and his coat removed. And in this setting, stripped of the formal architecture of dinner tables and drawing rooms, he looked different, not less imposing, just differently so, more present, more actual. "What I am about to tell you," he said, "is something that should have been told differently and to a different person. I am aware of that. I am also aware that you are standing here in this room at this hour through no fault of your own, and that sending you back to your room with nothing would be its own kind of cruelty." She said, "Then tell me." He picked up a document from the writing desk. He did not hand it to her immediately. He held it and looked at it for a moment as if deciding whether the paper itself had earned the right to speak. "Your sister came to me 4 months ago," he said, "before the Whitmore ball, before any of the public understanding of our situation had formed. She came to me through an intermediary, a solicitor named Mr. Holt, who handled certain matters for your father. She proposed an arrangement." Cordelia's hands tightened slightly in her lap, but she kept her face quiet. "An arrangement," she repeated. "A contractual one," he said. "She had information about my family that she had come across through channels I have since investigated and traced. It concerned my father's death and certain financial decisions he made in the final year of his life, decisions that were made under circumstances that were not entirely his own." He set the document on the desk and looked at her directly. "Your sister knew the name of the man who pressured my father into those decisions. She knew the nature of the agreement between them, and she had documentary evidence that would have been significantly damaging to this estate, to my brother's future, and to the reputation of the Ashmore name if it had been made public." Cordelia's chest had gone very still. "She offered you silence," she said slowly. "In exchange for marriage?" He said, "Yes." The fire made a small sound. The lamp held steady. Outside, far away, something moved in the grounds, an animal perhaps, and then the night was quiet again. Harriet, Cordelia thought. Harriet with her bright letters and her beautiful gowns and her precise warmth. Harriet who always knew exactly what a situation required and gave it with such grace that the calculation underneath never showed. And yet, even as the thought formed, Cordelia felt the unfairness of it. She did not know the full shape of what her sister had done or why. So she did not know what pressures had built behind that composed exterior over years of watching a father spend what he did not have, and a mother's plan for futures that required resources they could not honestly claim. She did not know, and she would not judge quickly. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because," he said, "you heard her name in this room, and because I have been trying to decide for 8 days how to handle a situation that I did not anticipate." She looked up at him sharply. "What situation?" He did not answer immediately. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her and looked out at the dark grounds, and the silence stretched between them like something being measured. "When I agreed to your sister's terms," he said at last, "I believed the matter was fully transactional. I would offer her position and security. She would provide the documents and her silence. There would be a marriage in name and in form, and we would conduct our lives with mutual respect and separate understandings." He paused. "And then you arrived." Cordelia said nothing because there was nothing to say that was safe. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the room with an expression that had come uncovered somewhere in the last several minutes, something that was not quite composed, not quite the controlled public face of the Duke of Harwick, something underneath it that was considerably more honest. "I am not telling you this to complicate your sister's position," he said carefully. "I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you because you are in this house and you are not blind, and I think you have already seen more than you were meant to. And I would rather you hear the truth from me than piece together a version of it that is incomplete and worse." There was a long pause. "What happened to your father?" she asked. "Who was the man?" His jaw tightened slightly. "A man named Lord Fenmore," he said. "Gerald Fenmore. He held significant debt over my father for nearly a decade. The financial decisions my father made in his final year, the ones that nearly broke the Eastern landholdings and left Sebastian without a proper inheritance, were made because Fenmore was pressing him. And then my father died, and the pressing stopped, and I spent 6 years trying to find out why it had started and how deep it went. Harriet found the document before I did. A letter in Fenmore's own hand, outlining the arrangement. Cordelia absorbed this slowly. And Fenmore. Is he still alive? Very much so. And the Duke said with a flatness in his voice that said more than the words. He is in London at present. He sits on 2 charitable committees and attends church on Sundays, and is considered by most of society to be a perfectly respectable man. She understood then the full weight of what her sister held and what it meant and why Gideon had agreed to the arrangement. It was not a weakness. It was the same thing that had kept her silent in the carriage all the way here, the understanding that people with power over the things you love rarely need to say so directly. Then he said something that changed the shape of everything she had just understood. 3 weeks before your sister wrote to my solicitor, he said quietly, she received a warning. A letter with no signature, delivered to your family home in the night. It told her that she had been seen making inquiries, that certain people were aware she had found something she should not have. It told her that if she did not surrender what she had found within 30 days, the consequences would not be legal ones. Cordelia felt the room tilt slightly. Someone threatened her life, she said. He nodded once. That was when she moved quickly, he said. She did not have 30 days to find a more careful solution. She had weeks, and she made the only calculation available to her that offered both protection and leverage. She came to me because a woman engaged to a duke is considerably harder to silence than a baronet's daughter with an inconvenient document. Cordelia sat very still. She came to you to survive, she said. Yes, he said. The arrangement was her terms. But the urgency behind it was fear. Something cracked open quietly inside Cordelia's chest. She thought of Harriet writing that cheerful letter from Harwick Manor. She thought of the brightness and the precision and the warmth carefully measured out. She thought of a woman who had discovered something dangerous and carried it alone for months with no one to tell and no safe direction to move in, and who had done the most Harriet thing possible, which was to find the strongest available position and step into it without showing a tremor. Does she know, Cordelia asked, that the threat is still active? Yes, he said. I told her 2 weeks ago. That is what we were discussing tonight when you opened the door. The warning she received has been traced to a man in Fenmore's employ, a solicitor named Crabbe who handles certain private matters for him. We believe Crabbe has someone watching this house. Cordelia looked at him. Someone inside the house, she asked. We are not certain yet, he said, but we are looking. She stood then because sitting felt wrong suddenly, too passive for the kind of information she was now holding. I will not speak of this, she said. Not to anyone. He watched her. I asked only one thing in return, she said, and she surprised herself with how steady her voice was. Be honest with me. Not about everything. I am not asking for everything. But if something happens in this house that I need to understand in order to protect myself or make clear decisions, I would rather you tell me than let me find it in a room I was not meant to enter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a reasonable request." She picked up her candle from the table near the door. "Call good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Miss Vane," he said. She walked out into the corridor and back through the dark east wing and through the portrait gallery and up to her room. And she lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling, and she did not sleep until dawn was already pale at the edges of the curtains. When she woke, Harriet was sitting on the edge of her bed. Her sister was already dressed, already composed, already wearing the particular expression she used when she had decided to approach something obliquely. She had a cup of tea in one hand, and she set it on the bedside table with a small, careful smile. "You were out of your room last night," Harriet said simply. Cordelia looked at her. "I could not sleep," she said. "I went looking for the library and took a wrong turn." Harriet's eyes were very steady. They were the same shade of brown as Cordelia's, but they did not function the same way. Harriet's eyes gave you information about what she wanted you to believe rather than about what she actually felt. "You found it eventually." "The library?" "No," Cordelia said. "I went back to bed." A small silence. "The east wing is sealed," Harriet said lightly, smoothing the blanket at the edge of the mattress. "The Duke prefers it that way. He is very private about certain parts of the house." Cordelia looked at her sister. She looked at the composed face and the careful hands and the bright measuring eyes, and she felt the full strange weight of loving someone who you were not entirely sure you knew. "I am sure he has good reasons," Cordelia said. Harriet smiled. "Of course he does," she said. "He is a very deliberate man." She patted Cordelia's hand and rose and went to the window and looked out at the morning grounds, and the sunlight fell across her shoulders, and she was beautiful and unreachable, and Cordelia felt the distance between them like a room she had never been invited into. "He is very deliberate," Harriet said again, more softly. And something in her voice, a note that did not belong to confidence, thin and quick and almost immediately covered, told Cordelia that her sister was more afraid than she was showing. Afraid of being found out, perhaps. Or afraid of something far worse than that. Cordelia drank her tea and said nothing and began very quietly to pay a different kind of attention to everything. The days that followed moved carefully, the way days move in houses where something is being kept below the surface. The house party continued. The meals were served on time. The guests rode in the mornings and played cards in the evenings and made the kind of conversation that kept itself deliberately light. And underneath all of it, like a current in still water, things shifted. Cordelia watched. She watched Harriet, who laughed at the right moments and steered conversations with quiet expertise, and stood beside the Duke at garden parties with the ease of a woman who had already measured the future and found it acceptable. She watched Gideon, who was present at every occasion and absent from none, and gave nothing away in public that he had not chosen to give. She watched Sebastian, who moved through the house like a man accustomed to being slightly out of place in it, cheerful on the surface and watchful underneath in a way that reminded her of herself more than she liked. And she watched Lord Fenmore. He had arrived on the third day after her conversation in the East Wing, coming up the drive in a carriage that was expensive and too clean, the carriage of a man who tended to appearances. He was perhaps 60, with heavy white sideburns, and a large, comfortable frame, and the sociable, unhurried manner of someone who had never once in his life been made to account for himself. He greeted the Duke like an old friend, which was either audacity or strategy, possibly both. No one had mentioned he was coming. Cordelia had been in the entrance hall when he arrived, coming down the stairs with a book under her arm, and she had paused on the landing and watched Gideon greet him. The Duke's face had been composed, perfectly composed, every line of it performing welcome. But his hand, the one at his side, not the one he extended for the handshake, had closed briefly into a fist and then opened again. She almost missed it. She did not miss it. Sebastian had been beside her on the landing, and she had glanced at him and found him already watching his brother with an expression that was very far from his usual lightness. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to Fenmore with something that was not quite anger and was not quite fear, and was the complicated territory between them. Then he noticed Cordelia looking at him, and he rearranged his face and said quietly, "That is Lord Fenmore," and said nothing more. She had said, "I know who he is." Sebastian had looked at her then, really looked at her, with an attention that had a question in it. She had moved down the stairs without answering it. Fenmore had brought 2 people with him, which no one had anticipated, and which the household had absorbed with the smooth professional grace of well-trained staff. The first was his personal valet, a lean, quiet man named Dobbins, who spoke to no one beyond the basic requirements of his role and moved through the servants' quarters with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with serving his master well. The second was a young woman introduced as his ward, Miss Nella Crabbe. She was perhaps 20, small and soft-featured, with light eyes and a manner so gentle and unassuming that she seemed to disappear into whatever room she entered. She apologized frequently for small things that required no apology. She smiled readily. She sat near windows and appeared to read, but her eyes moved more than a reader's eyes needed to. Cordelia noticed her on the first evening of Fenmore's arrival and said nothing to anyone. But that night, when she passed Mrs. Peel in the upper corridor, she said the name quietly, "Miss Nella Crabbe." And Mrs. Peel's step did not slow, but her chin lifted by a fraction. And the next morning there were 2 new footmen positioned in the main hall who had not been there the day before, and old Mr. Fenwick moved through the servants' quarters with a frequency that his knee joints did not normally allow. Cordelia understood then that the household had its own intelligence, quiet and practiced, built over years by people who had served the Ashmore family through worse than this. Over the following days, Fenmore expanded into the house party the way confident men always did, taking up space without asking, inserting himself into conversations, telling long anecdotes at dinner that everyone laughed at and no one fully listened to. He was attentive to Lady Mirabelle, who was rich and useful to know. He was genial with Lord Prentice. He was pleasant to Harriet in a way that had a very specific quality to it, too familiar, slightly too knowing, as if they shared a context she had not agreed to share. And Nella Crabbe sat 3 seats away at every dinner and appeared to attend to her food and smiled her soft smile and watched Harriet's face with a concentration she kept almost perfectly hidden. Almost. On the 5th day of Fenmore's visit, the household gathered on the south lawn for an afternoon garden party. The weather had turned generous, warm without the pressing heat of the past weeks, and the outdoor setting released people from some of their indoor formality. Tables had been arranged with refreshments, and there were games at the far end of the lawn, and Mrs. Fenwick moved between the guests with quiet efficiency and eyes that missed nothing. Cordelia sat at a table in the shade with Lady Mirabell, who was the kind of woman who said almost everything directly and very little cruelly, which was rarer than it should have been. "Your sister is going to accept him," Lady Mirabell said, watching Harriet across the lawn with the Duke at her side. "I believe so," Cordelia said. "And is she happy about it?" The question was asked without particular intent, simply curious, the way a woman who had married twice asked questions about marriage. Cordelia looked at Harriet across the lawn, at the beautiful profile and the composed posture, and the way she laughed at something the Duke said in a way that landed exactly right. "I am not sure," Cordelia said honestly. Lady Mirabell nodded as if this confirmed something. "He is not easy to read," she said. "I have known Gideon Ashmore since he was 19, and he has never once let his face tell you more than he decided to tell it. His father was the same. Great men very often are." She paused and her voice dropped. "His father's death was not peaceful," she said. "No," Cordelia agreed. Lady Mirabell looked at her sharply, then away. "There is more in this house than a marriage arrangement," she said. I say that as a woman who has lived long enough to smell when a house is holding something. And I say it because that man over there, tilting her chin almost imperceptibly toward Fenmore, has been making me uneasy since the moment he stepped out of that carriage." "What do you know about him?" Cordelia asked quietly. "Enough," Lady Mirabell said. "I knew his wife before she died. She was a quiet woman. Frightened quiet, not peaceful quiet. There is a difference, and I have never forgotten it." She set her teacup down with a small, precise movement. "His ward," she continued. "That girl, Nella. Do you know who her father is?" Cordelia looked at her. "Her surname is Crabbe," Lady Mirabell said simply. "The solicitor," Cordelia said very quietly. "The solicitor who sent your sister the threatening letter," Lady Mirabell confirmed. "She is not here as a ward. She is here as a pair of eyes, and possibly as something more dangerous than that if the situation calls for it." Cordelia felt the garden party around her continue its bright, cheerful surface while the ground beneath her shifted. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Yesterday morning," Lady Mirabell said. "I have connections your host does not know I have. I came to this house party at Gideon's mother's request, not as a social guest. His mother is in Bath and too ill to be here herself, and she asked me to watch. She has her own fears about this summer and what it may bring." She looked at Cordelia steadily. "I am telling you this because you are the second pair of careful eyes in this house, and I would rather we were looking in the same direction." Cordelia held her gaze. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "For now," Lady Mirabell said, "nothing. Watch the girl. Do not let her know you are watching, and tell me if she goes anywhere near your sister alone." Across the lawn, Sebastian appeared at Cordelia's table and dropped into the chair Lady Mirabell vacated as she rose smoothly to greet Lord Prentice with the natural ease of a woman changing scenes. He was carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, and he set one in front of Cordelia without asking if she wanted it. "You have been watching Fenmore," he said. "I have been watching everyone," she said. "You watch him differently." She picked up the lemonade and took a sip and did not confirm or deny this. Sebastian leaned slightly forward and lowered his voice, not with dramatic urgency, but with the careful quietness of someone choosing to trust. "I need you to understand something about why he is here," he said. "Gideon did not invite him. T. Fenmore invited himself, using a social mechanism that made it impossible to decline without public awkwardness. He does this. He puts himself in proximity to things he wants to monitor." "What does he want to monitor?" she asked. Your sister, Sebastian said simply. Cordelia set down the glass. He knows she has the letter. He suspects she has something, Sebastian said. He has suspected since April when she first made contact with Gideon. He has people who watch for certain kinds of activity, solicitors making unusual inquiries, documents changing hands. He is not stupid, and he has had a long time to build careful systems of protection. Then Harriet is in active danger, Cordelia said. Not distant danger. Present danger. Here at this party. Sebastian looked at her, and this time he did not soften it. Yes, he said. She thought about Nella Crabb's soft eyes and quiet smile, and the way they tracked Harriet across every room. She thought about Dobbins the valet, and the way he moved through the servants' quarters with more attention than a valet needed. She thought about what Lady Mirabelle had said. Eyes. And possibly something more dangerous. There is someone inside the household, she said. Not among the guests. Among the staff. Someone who reports back to Fenmore about what happens in this house after the candles go out. Sebastian went very still. Gideon suspects it, he said slowly. But we have not been able to identify who. I think it is more than one person, Cordelia said. He looked at her. Dobbins moves too freely for a visiting valet, she said. He has been in the eastern servants' corridor twice that I have seen. As that corridor leads to the back stairs near the east wing. He has no business being there. And there is a kitchen maid, the young one with red hair who serves the afternoon tea. She sets the cups down facing outward every single time, without exception. That is not a habit. That is a signal. Sebastian stared at her. Which kitchen maid? He said, and his voice had gone very quiet. She serves only when Miss Crabb is in the room, Cordelia said. I noticed it this morning and again an hour ago. Sebastian set down his glass carefully and looked across the lawn at nothing in particular, and she could see him thinking, the quick internal movement of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew. Her name is Penny, he said at last. She came to the household 6 weeks ago. A referral from an agency in London. An agency, Cordelia said. He nodded once and said nothing more because they both understood what that meant. Someone had placed her here in advance, weeks before the house party was even formally arranged, which meant someone had known what this summer would bring before it arrived. Cordelia looked across the lawn. Harriet was standing with the Duke and Lord Prentice, and her profile was perfect and composed, and she was speaking with that lovely precision that made her seem untouchable. She is not safe, Cordelia said. Not even here. Not even with him standing next to her. Sebastian followed her gaze. We are going to move the letter tonight, he said quietly. Gideon decided this morning. It cannot stay where it is. If Dobbins has been in the East Wing corridor, then Fenmore may already know the general location. Where will you move it? He looked at her. That is not something I should say aloud on a garden lawn, he said. Fair enough, she said. He picked up his lemonade again and looked across the party with the practiced expression of a man enjoying a pleasant afternoon, and she matched it. And they sat in their careful performance of calm, while the garden moved around them with its bright social surface and its hidden currents. Then something happened that none of them had prepared for. A sharp sound came from the far side of the lawn near the refreshment tables. Not a shout, not a crash. A short, choked cry that cut off too quickly. Every head turned. Harriet was standing beside the refreshment table with her hand pressed to her throat, and her face had gone the colour of old paper. The glass she had been holding was on the ground, the lemonade spreading across the grass in a pale stain. So the Duke was already at her side, his hand on her arm, his face showing more in that single unguarded moment than Cordelia had ever seen it show. Cordelia was on her feet before she had decided to stand. She crossed the lawn quickly, Sebastian a step behind her, and she reached her sister and took her other arm, and Harriet looked at her with eyes that were wide and strange and glassy. "The taste," Harriet said, very quietly. "Something in it." Cordelia looked at the glass on the ground. She looked at the refreshment table. She looked at the small gathering of guests drawing close with their concerned expressions, and she looked beyond them to where Nella Crabbe was standing at the edge of the group, with her hands folded and her soft eyes absolutely still, and her expression showing the precise amount of worry appropriate for a young woman witnessing a social mishap. Not a gram more, not a gram less. Sebastian had already turned away from the table and was speaking in a low, rapid voice to one of the new footmen, and the footman moved immediately toward the refreshment table with a quiet efficiency that cleared people away from it without making a scene. Lady Mirabelle appeared at Cordelia's shoulder. "Get her inside," she said, "now, not through the main doors. The side entrance near the rose garden. I will manage the guests." Gideon had his arm around Harriet and was already moving, and Cordelia stayed close on her other side, and they walked quickly across the grass and through the gate in the rose garden wall and into the cool, dim interior of the house's side corridor, and the sounds of the garden party continued behind them with only a slight, polite murmur of concern. Inside the corridor, Harriet's legs went uncertain, and Gideon caught her with both arms, properly this time, and the control in his face had cracked open at the edges in a way that told Cordelia more about the arrangement between them than anything she had yet been told directly. He was not indifferent to Harriet. He had simply been performing indifference because that was the shape of the agreement they had made. And now his composure was in pieces on the floor of a side corridor, and he was holding her sister with an expression that was frightened in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. Harriet's eyes found Cordelia's over his shoulder. "I knew," Harriet said softly. "I knew he would try eventually. I just did not think he would be so bold." Her voice was still thin, but it was already gathering itself back, the way Harriet's voice always did, finding its footing even when the rest of her had not. Cordelia looked at her sister and thought about all the months Harriet had spent alone with this, carrying something dangerous in a careful silence while their mother planned weddings and their father counted debts. And Cordelia sat in the second bedroom at home reading books and forming opinions and knowing nothing at all. "Ma," she took Harriet's hand and held it tightly. And Harriet, for the first time in as long as Cordelia could remember, held back without letting go. Down the corridor, Sebastian appeared with Dr. Albright, the household physician, who was a compact, serious man of 50 with a bag already in his hand, which told Cordelia he had been alerted before the incident occurred. Which meant someone had known it might happen. Which meant the trap had been set and partially sprung, and the evening had only just begun. Dr. Albright examined Harriet in the small sitting room off the side corridor with the door closed and the rest of them waiting outside in a silence that had different textures depending on who was holding it. Gideon stood with his back against the wall and his arms folded and his eyes on the closed door. He was still, the kind of still that was not calm, but was the thing that sits over calm when calm has been used up. Sebastian paced 4 steps in one direction and 4 steps back and stopped when he noticed he was doing it. Cordelia sat on the narrow bench beside the window and watched both of them and kept her own counsel. Mrs. Peel appeared at the end of the corridor and walked to the Duke and spoke in a voice so low that Cordelia caught only 2 words. Dobbins. And gone. Her Gideon's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a tightening along the jaw, a slight squaring of the shoulders. When? He said. Within the last 20 minutes, Mrs. Peel said. Thomas saw him leave through the kitchen yard with a bag. He did not stop him because there was no instruction yet to do so. A silence. And the girl? Gideon said. Still on the lawn, Mrs. Peel said. She has not moved from the party. She is being watched. Cordelia stood up. She will not run, she said. Both of them looked at her. She is not here to run. Dobbins was the one who needed to leave. He delivered whatever information he came here to gather, and his role is finished. But Nella Crabb's role is not finished yet. She is still waiting for something. What is she waiting for? Sebastian asked. Confirmation, Cordelia said. She is waiting to find out whether what was put in Harriet's glass was enough to create a serious situation. If Harriet collapses badly, she reports that back. If Harriet recovers quickly, she reports that back instead. She is a messenger, not a threat herself. Sebastian looked at his brother. She is right, he said. Gideon had been watching Cordelia the entire time she was speaking, with that reading attention of his that she had grown accustomed to and had not yet grown comfortable with. Then we let her stay, he said, and we let her see exactly what we want Fenmore to hear. The door opened and Dr. Albright came out with his bag and his serious face arranged into the slightly less serious expression of a man delivering tolerable news. A mild irritant, he said quietly. In the lemonade, enough to cause distress and disorientation, and not enough to cause lasting harm, though it was clearly not intended to be comfortable. I want her to rest for the remainder of the day. She is shaken, but she is well. Gideon thanked him in a tone that was controlled and even and entirely disconnected from the expression on his face. Dr. Albright went back down the corridor and his footsteps faded, and the five of them stood in the new shape of the information they had just received. Not enough to cause lasting harm, which meant Fenmore had not tried to kill Harriet today. He had tried to frighten her, to destabilize her, to make her feel that the house she believed was protecting her was not as sealed as she thought, that his reach extended even here, even into the refreshment table at a garden party on a warm afternoon, and that whatever she was holding could be taken from her in ways that had nothing to do with legal maneuvering. It was a message, Cordelia said. Yes, Gideon said. He wants her to know he can get to her, Sebastian said, so that she gives up the letter willingly rather than requiring more serious measures. And if she does not give it up? Cordelia asked. The more serious measures, Gideon said simply. She looked at him. Then we cannot wait any longer, she said. The letter needs to leave this house entirely. Tonight. Not just moved within the house. Gone. A pause. If it leaves the house, Sebastian said carefully, we lose our ability to use it as direct evidence in a legal proceeding unless we can establish its chain of custody clearly. If it stays in the house, Cordelia said, a Fenmore will take it by whatever means become necessary and we will have nothing. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze and did not look away. There is a third option, Mrs. Peel said. They all looked at her. She opened the leather folio she was carrying, the same one Cordelia had seen in the East Wing study on the night she opened the wrong door, and she removed a single folded document and held it out. This is a copy, she said. A very accurate one, prepared 3 days ago by a clerk in London whose discretion can be relied upon absolutely. The original and the copy are identical in every detail that matters legally. If we send out the copy tonight in a way that Dobbins can report back, Fenmore will believe he knows where the document is. Meanwhile, the original goes somewhere he will never think to look. Where? Cordelia asked. Mrs. Peel looked at her steadily. With you, she said. Cordelia said nothing for a moment. With me, she repeated. You are the only person in this house, Mrs. Peel said, who has no visible connection to the document, no known role in the arrangement, and no reason that Fenmore's people would think to follow. You are the sister, the companion, the unremarkable second daughter who came to keep her sister company. He has not looked at you twice. Sebastian made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Gideon was watching Cordelia with that expression again, the one that had stopped belonging entirely to itself and had started belonging partly to something else, something that sat in the narrow space between composure and its opposite. It would place you in a degree of danger, he said. I want to be honest about that. I am already in a degree of danger, she said. I have been since the night I opened that door. He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he nodded. Mrs. Peel refolded the folio, and Cordelia understood that the arrangement had been made and that she was now carrying something that a man had already threatened one woman's life to obtain, and she felt the weight of it settle into her chest alongside everything else she was already carrying, and she straightened her back and said nothing dramatic because the moment did not require drama. It required steadiness. She had always been good at that. The garden party wound down in the late afternoon with the guests drifting inside in twos and threes, and their conversations shifting from the warm outdoor lightness to the slightly more considered tones of people who had witnessed something unsettling and were performing their way through the memory of it. Harriet's indisposition was explained by the heat. It was accepted as an explanation. These things happened at summer parties. Nella Crabbe came indoors with the other guests and moved quietly through the drawing room, and Cordelia watched her from across the room and understood that she was sending a report to Dobbins in her mind, assembling what she had seen, measuring Harriet's public condition against her private instructions. Cordelia met her eyes once deliberately and smiled pleasantly, and Nella smiled back with her soft expression, and neither of them meant any of it. That evening at dinner the table felt different. The configuration was the same: the candles, the crystal, the careful placement of silver. But the currants underneath had rearranged themselves, and the people who were aware of this sat with a slightly different quality of attention than those who were not. Fenmore was in excellent spirits. He was witty and warm, and refilled his wine generously, and told a story about a hunting trip that made Sir Thomas laugh until his face went red. He inquired after Harriet's health with precisely calibrated concern, and expressed great relief at her recovery, and said the summer heat was treacherous for those with delicate constitutions. Harriet, who had come down to dinner against Dr. Albright's advice because she understood that absence was its own kind of signal, smiled at him across the table with a warmth so genuine in its surface that Cordelia felt a complicated pride in her. You are remarkable, she thought, looking at her sister. You are doing something I am not sure I could do. Sebastian was seated beside Miss Clara Fitch, who was asking him something about horses with the particular intense focus of a young woman who had decided that interest in horses was her most useful conversational tool at this specific moment. He answered her pleasantly while his eyes moved around the table in a slow, practiced pattern that covered everyone without stopping. Lady Mirabell, across from Cordelia, ate her soup and said almost nothing, and watched Fenmore with the quiet, unmeasured attention of a woman who had been watching powerful men misused their power for 40 years and had developed a very clear taxonomy of the type. After dinner, when the women gathered in the sitting room and the men remained at the table with their port, something happened that Cordelia had not anticipated. Nella Crabbe sat beside her, not accidentally, deliberately, with the small, decisive movement of someone who had been considering the approach and had chosen the moment. She said, "You are very observant, Miss Vane." Her voice was gentle. Everything about her was gentle, but the gentleness had a skeleton in it, something harder underneath. Cordelia looked at her pleasantly. "I enjoy people," she said simply. Nella smiled. "Yes," she said, "I think you do. I think you enjoy understanding them very specifically." A small pause. "I find this house very interesting," Nella continued, looking down at her hands. "There is so much history in it. So many things have been kept from such a long time ago." "It must be difficult to manage all of that," Cordelia said. "Old houses always are." Nella looked up. Her light eyes were direct now, the soft expression still in place but no longer doing what it usually did, no longer making you forget to look closely. "Lord Fenmore is very fond of your sister," she said. "He wishes her every happiness." "I am sure he does," Cordelia said. "He would be very relieved," Nella said carefully, "if the anxieties of recent months could be resolved. He is a man who values peace. He finds prolonged tension very wearing." Cordelia looked at her with a smile that gave nothing away. "Most people do," she said. Nella held her gaze for a moment, and then looked away, and the conversation closed and did not reopen. And they sat in the pleasant performance of two women sharing a sitting room until the men came through and the evening redistributed itself into its final social configurations. But as Cordelia rose to join the wider gathering, she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Nella Crabbe had just delivered a message, and the message was, "We know you are involved. We are watching you now too." She found Sebastian at her elbow within minutes and said very quietly, "She approached me. He said I saw." She said, "He knows I am not unremarkable after all." Sebastian said, "Then we move tonight. All of it. Every piece." She nodded and moved away into the room and spent the rest of the evening being as unremarkable as she possibly could, and felt the eyes on her back the entire time, and did not once let it show on her face. Later, alone in her room with the candle lit, and the document folded small and hidden in the lining of her travelling case, beneath 3 layers of clothing, she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together and breathed slowly. There was a knock at her door. She said, "Come in." It was Gideon. This was considerably more improper than the East Wing study had been, which had at least been a matter of wrong turns and accidents. This was her bedroom, and he was standing in the doorway in his evening coat, and there was nothing accidental about it. She did not tell him to leave. He said, "I wanted to know that you were all right." She looked at him. He said, "That is not the only reason I came, but it is the first one." She said, "What is the second reason?" He came into the room and left the door slightly open, which was the only concession available to propriety at this point, and he stood near the window and looked at her with that expression of his, that uncovered, unguarded thing that came out at night when the performance of the day had worn down. "When this is over," he said, "when Fenmore is dealt with, and the legal matter is settled, and your sister is safe, I want to say something to you that I cannot say now. Not while things are as they are. Not while you are in this house, in this position, and while she is here, and the arrangement stands." Cordelia felt something move through her chest that she had been keeping very carefully locked. She said, "Then do not say it now." "No," he said. When it is over, she said. Yes, he said. They looked at each other across the room. She said, Is she truly safe tonight? He said, There are 4 people watching this corridor and 2 at every exit. She is safe tonight. Good, Cordelia said. Then go. Before someone decides the door being open is insufficient. The corner of his mouth moved. Good night, Miss Vane, he said. Good night, Your Grace, she said. He left and she sat in the quiet and put her face in her hands for a moment and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of feeling everything she was not allowed to feel. And then she lifted her head and put it away and lay down and listened to the house breathe around her until she slept. She woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices, not close, somewhere below in the lower part of the house, muffled by floors and walls, but audible in the particular carrying way that voices had at that hour when everything else was silent. She was out of bed and at her door before she was fully awake, her travelling case checked with one quick movement, the document still in its lining, undisturbed. The voices had stopped by the time she reached the landing. The house was dim and very still. One lamp burned in the entrance hall below, throwing a low circle of light on the marble floor. She went down the stairs quietly, one hand on the banister, and at the bottom she found Mr. Fenwick standing in the hall in his dressing gown, with his face arranged into the expression of a man who had just made a very unpleasant decision and was prepared to stand behind it. What happened? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, measuring, and then said, One of the footmen found Dobbins at the kitchen gate an hour ago. He had come back. Why? Mr. Fenwick said. He was looking for something he had not managed to retrieve during his time here. A document. Cordelia's hand tightened on the banister. He did not find it, Mr. Fenwick said. He was detained. His Grace has been informed. Where is he now? In the groundskeeper's cottage, Mr. Fenwick said, with 2 of our men and a locked door. She nodded, and the old butler looked at her with something that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it, with the look of a man who respected competence regardless of where it appeared. She found Gideon in the study off the main hall, the proper study this time, the one that was part of the house's official geography. He was fully dressed despite the hour, which told her he had not slept. Sebastian was with him, sitting in the leather chair by the cold fireplace with his coat off and his hair disarranged, and the look of a man who had been awake for the same reason. Mrs. Peel was at the writing desk. Dobbins came back for the document, Cordelia said. Gideon looked at her. He came back because Fenmore told him to, he said, which means Fenmore knows the copy was a copy, or suspects it. How could he know so quickly? Sebastian said, Nella Crabbe. Cordelia understood immediately, the conversation on the sofa. Nella had looked at her and measured her and reported back, and whatever she had reported had been enough for Fenmore to understand that the woman he had dismissed as the unremarkable companion was actually the one holding the real document, which meant the decoy had failed because she had tipped her own hand by being approached at all. She is cleverer than she looks, Cordelia said quietly. Most dangerous people are, Sebastian said. Cordelia sat down in the chair across from him and looked at Gideon. Fenmore will move openly now, she said. He has no choice. He cannot retrieve the document through quiet means because I have it, and he cannot approach me quietly without creating exactly the kind of scene that would draw the wrong attention. So he will do something that changes the shape of the situation entirely. What does that mean? Sebastian asked. It means he will create a reason for me to be discredited, she said, or removed from the house. Something that makes the document I am holding inadmissible or irrelevant before it can be used. He needs to change the story before the story can be told, Gideon said. He already has. She looked at him. He crossed to the writing desk and lifted a letter and held it out. This was delivered to the house 2 hours ago by a private messenger, he said. It is addressed to me. It contains a claim. The claim is that you, Miss Cordelia Vane, obtained certain documents from a private residence in London 4 months ago by means that were neither legal nor authorised, and that your presence in this house and your involvement in the current matter constitute not a good faith effort to serve justice, but a personal vendetta motivated by financial grievance against the Ashmore family. She took the letter and read it. It was precise. It was detailed. It named dates and places she had never been and transactions she had never made, and it was written in the smooth, confident language of a man who had done this before, who had manufactured clean-looking lies with the same ease that others manufactured truths. He invented it, she said. Entirely, Gideon confirmed, but it does not need to be believed universally. It only needs to create enough doubt that a legal proceeding becomes complicated, that a solicitor raises concerns, that a judge looks at the provenance of the document with suspicion. He paused. And then there is the second part, he said. She looked up from the letter. The second part, he said carefully, concerns your sister. The room went very quiet. The claim, he continued, is that Harriet Vane did not come by the document through independent discovery. The claim is that she obtained it through a relationship with a member of this household, a relationship of an inappropriate nature. The claim names my brother. Sebastian said nothing. He was very still in his chair, and his face had gone to a place she had not seen it go before, somewhere past lightness, and past the careful management of things to something raw and private. Cordelia looked at Sebastian, and she understood. It was not a fabrication, not entirely. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the quality of his stillness. Oh, the kind of stillness that comes when a truth you have been holding very carefully is suddenly in the room without your permission. Sebastian, she said quietly. He looked at the fireplace. It was before she came here, he said. It was before any of this. We met in London in February, at a private gathering. I did not know who she was. She did not know who I was. We spoke for an evening, and then a second evening, and then a third. And somewhere in those conversations, she told me things about her family's situation that she should not have told me. Not because she was using me. I do not believe that. I believe she simply needed to tell someone, and I was there, and it was the middle of the night, and we were honest with each other in the way people sometimes are when they do not expect to meet again. He paused. She found the document later, he said, after we had parted, and she came to Gideon because of the document, not because of me. But she knew about the Ashmore family, Cordelia said, before the document, because of you. Yes, Sebastian said simply. Gideon stood very still with his hands at his sides. Sebastian, Cordelia said, does Fenmore know the truth of this or only the shape of it? He knows the shape, Sebastian said. He knows Harriet had prior knowledge of the family before she made contact officially. He does not know the details, but the shape is enough to suggest that the entire arrangement was orchestrated from the beginning, which makes Harriet look calculating and makes the document look like part of a scheme rather than an independent discovery. It makes her look dishonest, Cordelia said. And a dishonest woman's evidence, Sebastian said, does not carry in a court of law the way an honest woman does. Cordelia set the letter down on the desk. She sat with this for a moment. The full picture of it. Harriet, who had met Sebastian in February, and spoke too honestly to a kind stranger in a way that was absolutely Harriet, giving warmth in unguarded moments and then immediately rebuilding the walls. Harriet, who had found the document and made her calculations, came to Gideon and never mentioned Sebastian, because to mention him was to complicate everything. Harriet, who had been carrying not one secret but two. She looked at Gideon. He was looking back at her. There was something complicated in his face, something that had nothing to do with the legal matter. She understood that he was not angry at his brother. He was something else. Something that had to do with February in London and an honest conversation in the middle of the night between two people who did not expect to meet again. He had not known. And now that he knew, something had rearranged itself in the geography of this arrangement. Some piece had moved, and the map was not what it had been an hour ago. "We need to find Agnes Lyle," Cordelia said, because if she did not say something concrete and practical, she was going to feel too much, and the morning was not finished yet. Gideon pulled himself back from wherever he had gone. "Yes," he said. "Without Agnes Lyle, the letter alone is corroborated only by the claim of women whose motives Fenmore has now publicly muddied," Cordelia said. "But if Agnes Lyle is a witness to the original agreement, her testimony changes the weight of everything. It is no longer Harriet's word, it is not Sebastian's. It is independent." Mrs. Peel spoke from the writing desk. "I found her," she said. Everyone turned. Mrs. Peel had the manner of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say this and had decided the moment had arrived. "Agnes Lyle has been living in Derbyshire for the past 11 years under the name Mrs. Agnes Pryor," she said. "She married a farmer named William Pryor 3 years after she left this household. I have her address. I have written to her twice under a private name. She has not responded to the letters." "Because she is afraid," Sebastian said. "Yes," Mrs. Peel said. "She saw what happened to the late Duke. She left this house and changed her name and built a life designed to be invisible. She will not come forward on the basis of a letter from a stranger." "Then someone needs to go to her," Cordelia said. "In person. Someone she has no reason to fear." A pause. She looked around the room. "I will go," she said. Gideon said, "Absolutely not." She looked at him. "You are already carrying the document," he said. "If Fenmore's people follow you out of this house and you are travelling alone toward the one witness who can corroborate everything, the situation becomes significantly worse." "I will not be alone," she said. He looked at her steadily for a long moment, and she could see him working through the calculation and finding no version of it that he fully liked. "Sebastian," she said, "will come with me. We will leave this morning, early, before the household is properly awake, before Nella Crabbe has had her tea and sent her morning report. We will be in Derbyshire by evening. We will speak to Agnes Lyle. And we will come back with either her agreement to testify or her written account, which under certain legal provisions carries its own admissibility." Sebastian had straightened in his chair. The rawness in his face had settled into something more resolved. "I know the road to Derbyshire," he said. Gideon looked at him. Then at Cordelia. Then he looked away, which was as close to agreement as he came at 5 in the morning with a forged letter on his desk and his brother's history, rearranged in front of him, and the woman who had walked through the wrong door 3 weeks ago, now standing in his official study telling him her plan, with a steadiness that made the room feel more manageable than it had any right to be. "There is one more thing," Lady Mirabelle said. She was standing in the doorway. No one had heard her come. She looked entirely unsurprised by the scene she had walked into, which suggested she had been outside the door for some portion of the conversation, and no one challenged this because she had already proven she was on the right side of things, and the morning had used up most of the available energy for objection. Nella Crabbe, she said, has a letter sewn into the lining of her second travelling case. I know this because I have the same seamstress and I recognise the stitching. What kind of letter? Gideon asked. The kind that tells a story about this household, Lady Mirabelle said, written in advance, ready to be posted if certain things do not go Fenmore's way today. It's named Sebastian. It names the arrangement. It has enough names to make a considerable public spectacle. She looked around the room. You have until this evening before she decides whether to send it. The carriage left Harwick Manor at 5:30 in the morning. Cordelia and Sebastian rode in silence for the first mile, both of them watching the grounds through the window as the house disappeared behind the tree line, tall and pale, and holding its secrets in the early grey light. The document was still in the lining of Cordelia's travelling case, which sat on the seat beside her with the ordinary appearance of a bag belonging to a woman making a short journey. Sebastian had a pistol in his coat pocket. He had not mentioned it. She had noticed it anyway. Do you think she will speak to us? He asked when the manor was fully out of sight. I think she has been waiting 11 years for someone to come, Cordelia said. I think waiting is its own kind of exhaustion. And I think when she opens the door and sees that we made the effort to find her, that will matter more than the letters did. He looked out the window. She was kind, he said. Agnes. When I was young. She used to bring warm rolls to the schoolroom on cold mornings without being asked. Small things. But I remember them. Cordelia looked at him gently. Tell her that, she said. When we arrive. Tell her exactly that. He nodded and said nothing more, and the carriage moved through the early morning countryside while behind them at Harwick Manor, the house began its slow waking, and Nella Crabbe had her morning tea, and Lord Fenmore slept the comfortable sleep of a man who believed he had already won. Back at the house, things moved. Gideon had not slept and did not intend to. He spent the early hours with Mr. Fenwick and Mrs. Peel going through the servants' records with a thoroughness that was long overdue, and by 7 in the morning they had confirmed what Cordelia had suspected the day before. Penny, the red-haired kitchen maid, had been placed in the household through an agency in London that traced back through 2 layers of intermediary to a property management firm that Gerald Fenmore had used for 15 years. She was brought to the study at 7:30. She was 19 years old and frightened in a way that had nothing to do with it. A girl who had been paid to watch and signal and had not fully understood until this moment what she had been placed inside. Gideon was not unkind to her. He was direct, and he was clear, and he told her that her choices now were simple. She could tell him everything she had passed to Dobbins and everything she had observed, and her part in the matter would be treated as the minor role it was. Or she could say nothing and find herself on the wrong side of a legal proceeding that was going to be very public and very thorough. She told him everything within 10 minutes. It was not much. She had reported movements, times, the location of certain rooms being accessed after dark. She had confirmed to Dobbins that the East Wing was being used. She had not known about the document specifically, had not known about Harriet's arrangement or the nature of the threat. She was a small cog placed carefully in a large machine by a man who understood that small cogs were easier to deny than large ones. When she finished, Gideon told Mrs. Fenwick to give her tea and keep her in the kitchen and away from the rest of the staff, and then he went to find Lady Mirabelle. She was already dressed, which surprised him, and already thinking, which did not. "I need Nella Crabbe occupied until evening," he said. Lady Mirabelle looked at him. "How?" "In company. Social, visible, deliberate company that makes it difficult for her to slip away and post anything without being noticed." Lady Mirabelle considered this. "I will take her to the village with Clara and Poppy," she said. "I will make it an invitation she cannot refuse without being rude, and I will keep her busy and watch until you tell me otherwise." She paused. "And Fenmore?" Gideon said. "Leave Fenmore to me." He found him at breakfast, which Fenmore was consuming with appetite and good humour, his large frame settled comfortably at the table, his conversation flowing easily with Lord Prentice. He looked up when Gideon entered and smiled the smile of a man performing innocence from long practice. Gideon sat down across from him and waited until Lord Prentice had excused himself and the room had emptied. And then he said very quietly, "I know about Penny." Fenmore's expression did not collapse. Men like him did not let expressions collapse, but something behind his eyes shifted, a small, careful recalibration. "I do not know what you mean," he said pleasantly. "I also know about the letter you sent last night," Gideon said, "the one making claims about Miss Cordelia Vane. I know it was fabricated. I have already spoken with my solicitor in London who will be filing a formal response before noon." Fenmore set down his fork. "And I know," Gideon continued, in the same quiet, even tone, "about the letter sewn into the lining of Miss Crabbe's travelling case, the one you intend to use if this morning does not go the way you want." A silence. Fenmore looked at him across the breakfast table, and the pleasant sociable surface of him thinned slightly, like ice at the end of winter, still present but no longer reliable. "You have been busy," he said. Gideon said, "You threatened a woman's life. You placed a spy in my household. You poisoned a guest at my garden party. You fabricated legal documents, and you have been blackmailing this family through intermediaries for 11 years. I am telling you this now, in this room, with no witnesses, because I am giving you the opportunity to leave this house today with something resembling dignity. That opportunity will not exist tomorrow." Fenmore studied with him. "You have no witness," he said. "Without a witness to the original agreement, you have a letter and a theory." Gideon said nothing. Fenmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "Without Agnes," he said carefully, "you have nothing." Gideon looked at him across the table and let the silence do its work. And he watched the moment Fenmore understood that the silence was not emptiness but the opposite. And he watched the man's large, comfortable certainty shift on its foundations for the first time. He said nothing more. He rose, straightened his coat, and walked out of the breakfast room. In Derbyshire, the carriage pulled up a long, narrow lane to a farmhouse that was modest and well kept, with a garden that had been tended with the particular care of someone who had learned to find peace in small, controllable things. Chickens moved in the yard. Smoke came from the chimney. The morning was cool and bright. A woman came to the door before they had finished climbing down from the carriage. She was perhaps 60, with grey hair pulled back neatly and a face that had lived in it, that carried the marks of weather and work and something older and harder underneath. She looked at Sebastian and went very still. "Mr. Ashmore," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Mrs. Pryor," Sebastian said. He took off his hat. "I am sorry it took us so long to find you." Something moved through Agnes Lyle's face like weather passing. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "You had better come in." The farmhouse kitchen was warm and smelled of bread and the morning. They sat at the scrubbed wooden table, and Agnes made tea with the automatic movements of a woman who needed to do something with her hands. Jean Sebastian told her about warm rolls on cold mornings, and she turned from the stove and looked at him for a long moment, and then sat down and pressed her hands flat on the table. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I told William it would come. He said I was worrying myself needlessly." She looked at Cordelia. "You are the vain girl, the sister." "Yes," Cordelia said. "She has the letter?" "She obtained it, yes," Cordelia said carefully. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Lord Fenmore told your father he would ruin him," she said. "Not the late Duke." "Your father," she said to Sebastian. "He said he would expose certain gambling debts your father had accumulated, and certain transactions he had made that were not entirely above board. Small things. Things that could have been managed. But the exposure would have been enough to break the family's standing. He held it over him for years. He told him what to sign and what to sell and where to move money, and your father did it because he had no other way." She stopped. "I was there when the final agreement was signed," she said. "I was carrying correspondence that day, and I walked into the library and they were both there, Lord Fenmore and your father. And there was a second man, a witness, a young solicitor named Crabbe, and they had papers on the table." "Crabbe?" Cordelia said. Agnes nodded. "I turned to leave. Your father saw me and he looked at me." She paused. "The way you look at someone when you want them to remember. Not to do anything. Just to remember." So I did. And 6 weeks later, he was dead, and I was afraid, and I left. She looked at her hands. "I should not have left," she said. "I have known that for 11 years. "You were alone and frightened," Sebastian said quietly. "You did what you could do." Agnes looked at him. "I will write it down," she said. "Everything I saw, every detail I can remember. And if it comes to a proceeding, I will come. I am not young and I am not strong, but I am still here. And Crabbe's son does not frighten me the way his father did." Cordelia reached across the table and covered Agnes's hand with hers. "That is all we need," she said. They spent 2 hours at the farmhouse. Agnes wrote in a clear, careful hand that spoke of a good education applied to a humble life, and she wrote without hesitation and without softening, naming names and dates and the precise language of what she had witnessed. And when she finished, she signed it, and Cordelia folded it carefully and placed it with the document in the lining of the travelling case, and closed it. And the three of them sat for a moment in the kitchen with the quiet feeling of something that had been unresolved for a very long time settling finally into its proper shape. At the door, Agnes held Sebastian's hand for a moment. "He was a good man," she said. "Your father. He was not a brave one, but he was good." Sebastian said, "I know." They drove back through the afternoon and arrived at Hurwick Manor as the light was going golden and long across the grounds. Lady Mirabelle's carriage was already back in the drive, which meant Nella Crabbe was inside, which meant the letter had not yet been sent. Aunt Cordelia felt this as a quiet relief in her chest that released something she had been holding without realizing it. Gideon was on the steps when the carriage pulled up. He did not come down to meet them. He stood at the top of the steps in the evening light and watched them descend, and his eyes went first to Cordelia, which was not something she had time to examine right now, and she looked back at him and gave him the smallest nod. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he came down the steps. That evening, Lord Fenmore left Hurwick Manor. He announced it at dinner with the smooth composure of a man choosing his own exit, citing business in London, expressing warm gratitude to his host, pressing Harriet's hand with a gentleness that made Cordelia's stomach tighten. He smiled and said his farewells, and his carriage was brought around, and he stepped into it with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided that strategic retreat was simply good sense. Nella Crabbe left with him. She passed Cordelia in the entrance hall on the way to the carriage and did not say anything. But she looked at her, one long, direct look that had the soft performance entirely stripped away. And what was underneath it was not malice exactly. It was the look of someone who recognized they had underestimated the wrong person. Cordelia held her gaze and said nothing. The carriage rolled away down the drive and the sound of it faded into the evening, and the house breathed out slowly around them. Later, Harriet came to Cordelia's room. She did not bring tea this time. She came in and sat on the bed, and for once she did not arrange her face into anything. She just sat, and the tiredness in her showed, the real kind, the kind that lives underneath years of performing composure. Sebastian told me you went to Derbyshire, she said. Cordelia said, yes. Harriet was quiet for a long moment. You did not have to do any of this, she said. You came here to keep me company. That is all you were asked to do. I know, Cordelia said. Why did you? Cordelia looked at her sister. At the beautiful tired face, and the careful hands, and the eyes that were finally, at this hour, in this room, showing what they actually held. Because you are my sister, she said, and because you have been carrying things alone for too long and I should have noticed sooner. While Harriet looked at her and something broke open quietly in her expression. I was going to tell you, she said, about Sebastian. About all of it. I kept meaning to, and then the arrangement was in place and it was easier to let you believe the simpler version. The simpler version where you were marrying a duke for sensible reasons, Cordelia said. Yes, Harriet said, that one. And what is the true version? Harriet looked at her hands. The true version, she said slowly, is that I met a man in February who was kind and funny and honest at 2 a.m, and I said more than I should have. And then I found a document that gave me the only protection available to me, and I used it. And somewhere between all of that, I stopped knowing which part was calculation and which part was something else. She looked up. I do not love the Duke, she said. I respect him. I think I could build something decent with him. But I do not love him. Cordelia was very still. And Sebastian? She asked, very carefully. Harriet smiled just briefly, with something in it that was completely unguarded. That, she said, is a different and much more complicated question. They sat together in the quiet of the room for a while, two sisters with the truth finally between them, instead of around them, and it was uncomfortable and tender in equal measure, the way truth usually was. 3 days later, the formal arrangements at Hawick Manor underwent a quiet and significant change. The engagement between the Duke of Hawick and Miss Harriet Vane was not announced. The house party concluded naturally. The guests departed in good order. Agnes Lyle's written account, it combined with the original letter and the testimony collected through proper legal channels over the following weeks, formed the basis of a proceeding that would occupy Mr. Fenmore's considerable attention for the better part of the next year, and leave him significantly diminished on the other side of it. Sebastian left for London the same day as the other guests, but he and Harriet spoke privately for an hour in the garden before his carriage came, and Cordelia watched from the library window and did not try to read their faces, because some things were not hers to read. She stayed an extra day at Hawick Manor on an excuse that satisfied no one who was paying attention. On the morning of her last day, she walked in the garden early, as she had on so many mornings, and Gideon was there. As she had known he would be, was sitting on the stone bench where Sebastian had sat on her first morning, doing nothing, looking at the middle distance. She sat across from him and the garden was cool and quiet, and the house was behind them with all its sealed wings, and its long history and its secrets that were finally, slowly, beginning to open. He said, "I told you there was something I wanted to say when it was over." She said, "Yes." He looked at her directly. "I have been looking at you," he said, "since the morning you arrived on that drive and tilted your head back to look at the house. Not because I intended to, because I could not help it. And I have spent 6 weeks telling myself the reasons why that was not something I was permitted to feel." She said nothing, which was the right response. "None of those reasons," he said, "are as solid as they were 3 weeks ago." Harriet," she said. "Harriet is not in love with me," he said quietly. "We both know this. We have both known it for some time. The arrangement was made out of necessity, and it served its purpose, and it protected her when she needed protecting. But it was never what it appeared to be on the surface, and the surface was always the only place it existed." She looked at him. "I am not asking you for an answer this morning," he said. "I am asking you not to disappear from this house and go back to your father's estate and become the second daughter who came and went and read books and was forgotten. I am asking you to let this be a beginning of something and not an ending." Cordelia looked at the garden, at the roses and the gravel and the dew still on the grass and the morning light coming in long and clean across everything. She thought about the night she had walked out of her room into the dark hall with her candle, taking a wrong turn she had not meant to take, opening a door she had not been meant to open. She thought about everything on the other side of it. She said, "I do not disappear easily. You should know that by now." He said, "I do know that." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the garden was very quiet around them, and everything that was going to happen next was still ahead of them, unwritten, unhurried, beginning now. She said, "Then I suppose you had better write to my father." And the corner of his mouth moved into something that was real and unguarded and entirely his own, and the morning held it. And Hurwick Manor breathed slowly behind them, and the door that had opened in the dark 3 weeks ago had led, after everything, to somewhere worth finding.